I still remember the exact second it happened, 10:00 a.m. sharp, the moment my world shattered, or so he thought. "Pack your things, Alex, you're done here." The voice belonged to Marcus Hale, CEO of Helix Dynamics, one of Silicon Valley's flashiest tech startups. Charismatic, ruthless, every inch of him was a predator wrapped in $1,000 suit. For 3 years, I'd been his right-hand man, building his empire, cleaning his messes, watching him take credit for every breakthrough I created. And now I was standing in his glass-walled office, surrounded by awards that should have had my name engraved on them, being fired like an intern who spilled coffee on his laptop. I didn't even ask why. I already knew. It all started 6 months ago when we began developing Neuralink X, a neural, integrated AI system meant to revolutionize brain-to-machine communication. It was our moonshot project, our $560 million baby. But the closer we got to launch, the more Marcus changed. He stopped calling it our project. It became his. He stopped saying we. He started saying I. And every time he did, something inside me cracked a little more. I'd been working 80-hour weeks, surviving on caffeine and code, while he smiled for magazine covers and bragged to investors about his visionary leadership. The truth, he couldn't even read half the neural network models without me walking him through them like a child. But I played along, I smiled, I clapped when he got his Innovator of the Year award. I even gave a speech at his gala dinner, calling him the mind behind the revolution. I lied through my teeth because I thought loyalty mattered. That morning, the office had been unusually quiet. People avoided eye contact. Slack channels had gone dead, and Marcus's assistant wouldn't even meet my eyes when she told me, "He wants to see you now." When I entered his office, he didn't even look up from his laptop. "Alex," he said coldly, "we're restructuring. Your role is being made redundant." Redundant, that word hit harder than I expected. "You're firing me?" I asked, forcing a smile. A week before launch, he leaned back, finally looking at me, and the smug smirk on his face said everything. "It's not personal," he lied. "We just need to streamline the leadership image. Investors like a single face." I laughed softly. "You mean your face?" His silence confirmed it. He was cutting me out, the man who built his dream just before payday, so he could take full credit and a bigger cut of the IPO. I looked at him, really looked. The polished charisma, the confidence, the arrogance. Beneath it all was fear. Fear that I might outshine him. Fear that the truth might get out. So I nodded slowly. "Sure, Marcus, I understand." He smiled, thinking I'd accepted defeat. "Good. HR will process your exit. Security will escort you out." That was his mistake. He underestimated me. When I reached my desk, my computer access had already been revoked. Typical Marcus, efficient and cruel. But he'd forgotten one thing: I'd built the core of Neuralink X's infrastructure myself, layer by layer. And inside that architecture was something only I knew existed. A silent partition, a fail-safe, something he'd never find in time. As I packed my things, I glanced around the open office, developers typing nervously, designers pretending not to notice the drama. I caught the eye of Lee, one of our lead engineers, and the flicker of pity there almost made me laugh. Everyone thought I was finished. At 10:20 a.m., I walked out of Helix Dynamics, my badge deactivated, my career supposedly destroyed. By 10:30, I was sitting in my car, watching the reflection of the company's glass tower in my rear-view mirror, that gleaming monument to greed. My hands were steady, my breathing calm, because I already knew what he didn't. Every piece of code in Neuralink X, every encrypted module, every neural pattern interface was tied to a single digital signature. Mine. Without it, the system wouldn't fully boot. It would seem operational, but within hours, it would collapse, corrupted, unstable, unusable. The launch was scheduled for 4:00 p.m. That gave me just under 6 hours to make a choice: walk away quietly and start over, or make sure Marcus Hale learned what happens when you betray the wrong person. I didn't even have to think twice. As the clock ticked closer to noon, I found myself in a nearby cafe, laptop open, VPN humming. On the screen was a single line of code blinking at me, the key to Neuralink X's activation. Delete it and the system dies. Transfer it and it lives again under a new owner. I stared at that line for a long time, sipping my coffee, thinking about every sleepless night, every stolen credit, every lie. Marcus had fired me at 10 a.m. By 4 p.m., I'd make sure the entire $160 million launch belonged to me, and the best part, he wouldn't even realize it until it was far too late. 3 years before that 10 a.m. firing, I would have called Marcus Hale my friend. Back then, Helix Dynamics wasn't a glass tower, it was a converted warehouse with leaky ceilings, cheap furniture, and a dozen dreamers chasing something big. He'd walk in with his energy drinks and impossible promises, talk about changing the world, and somehow make everyone believe it, including me. He wasn't my boss at first, we were partners. At least, that's what I thought. I was the engineer, the one writing lines of code deep into the night, while Marcus was the face of the operation, the talker, the charmer. He had this way of making you feel like you were part of something legendary. Every late night brainstorm ended with him clinking glasses and saying, "When we make it, Alex, we'll make it together." Funny how easily words fade once money enters the room. The first red flag appeared almost too small to notice. Marcus had started taking investor calls that weren't on our shared calendar, late night ones, whispered and brief. When I asked, he'd wave me off. "Just networking," he'd say, smiling. "You don't want to sit through these boring VC talks, trust me." But something about his tone didn't sit right, especially the way he'd turn off his smartwatch notifications right before the calls. Then came the favoritism. He began promoting people who hadn't earned it, interns turned strategy leads. Social media managers suddenly calling themselves project heads. They weren't smarter, they were just more compliant. They laughed at his jokes, echoed his ideas, flattered him. Meanwhile, I was buried under impossible deadlines, rewriting code at 3 a.m., while those same people were out celebrating team victories. Still, I told myself it was fine. He was under pressure, the investors wanted results. We'd been friends too long for him to betray me. At least that's what I kept repeating to myself. Then there were the lies. Small ones at first. "I sent your email to the board." Or, "Don't worry, I mentioned your name in the investor call." I believed him because I wanted to, until I stumbled across the quarterly board report one night. I wasn't supposed to see it, but when you manage the entire digital infrastructure, you see everything. Marcus had rewritten our project overview, replacing every instance of Alex and I with I. Every single one. He didn't even bother to hide it. Reading those words felt like a punch to the gut. My name wasn't just missing, it had been erased, like I'd never existed. I sat there staring at the screen for a long time, hands trembling, realizing that maybe this wasn't an accident. Maybe it was a rehearsal for something worse. That's when I started documenting everything, the emails, the chat logs, the timestamps. I didn't know what I'd use them for, but something inside me whispered, "You'll need this." A few weeks later, I noticed another shift: the money issues. Our expense sheets didn't add up. Invoices went missing. $2 million consulting fee appeared in our ledger, linked to a shell company with no website and a single registered name, Hale Tech Holdings, Marcus's personal holding firm. When I brought it up, he brushed it off with a laugh. "It's just a tax strategy, Alex. You know how it is, the big leagues play by different rules." Different rules, right. He used to say, "Transparency is the foundation of trust." Now he was rewriting that foundation in invisible ink. That night, while checking the backup logs, I saw that he'd started locking certain files with new admin privileges, ones I didn't have access to. That was when I truly understood. He was preparing to cut me out. And yet, I still couldn't hate him, not yet. There was a time Marcus and I were unstoppable. I still remember our first major prototype, an early version of what would become Neuralink X. We'd stayed up 48 hours straight debugging it, surviving on cold pizza and cheap coffee. When it finally worked, we just sat there in stunned silence. Then Marcus laughed that deep, proud laugh that filled the room and said, "We just made history." He hugged me genuinely. No cameras, no investors, just us. That memory kept me from walking away long before he fired me. I clung to it like a fool clings to hope, but the cracks widened. He started holding closed door meetings without inviting me. When I confronted him, he said, "Don't take it personally. You're the tech guy, let me handle the politics." And then came the launch committee. Every major launch needed a public face. We'd agreed months ago to do the presentation together, him on the business side, me on the technical demonstration. But 1 week before the big day, I found the new agenda on the company portal. Neuralink X launch presented by Marcus Hale, founder and chief innovator. No mention of me, no co-founder title, just a polite omission, one that told the whole story. When I confronted him that evening, he didn't even flinch. "Alex, you'll get your credit eventually," he said, sipping his wine, "but investors like a single visionary. It's cleaner branding." Cleaner branding, I repeated quietly. "So I'm just the janitor now." He chuckled. "You're overthinking this." But his eyes betrayed something, that glint of control, that quiet warning that said, "Don't push me." That was the moment I realized the man I'd trusted had been gone for a long time. What stood in front of me wasn't my friend anymore. It was a brand wearing his face. The emotional strain was unbearable. Every day felt like walking through a fog of betrayal I couldn't quite prove. I started questioning myself. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just the tech guy who didn't understand the game. Sleep became a luxury. My mind kept replaying conversations, subtle tone changes, little dismissals. I noticed how people stopped looking me in the eye when I walked into rooms, how they'd go silent when Marcus passed by. He was charming, magnetic. He knew how to control the narrative, and I was slowly becoming the villain in his version of the story. I'd hear whispers in the hallway, "Alex is slipping. Marcus said he's hard to work with. He's lucky to still be here." Lucky. The word echoed in my head for days. Then came the breaking point, the day before everything exploded. Marcus called me into his office, voice unusually calm. "We need to reassign your responsibilities," he said. "Lee's going to oversee the final integration phase. You'll take a step back." I froze. "Lee," he smiled, smooth as ever. "She's been loyal. She gets my vision." My vision. It wasn't even subtle anymore. "Marcus," I said, trying to steady my voice, "you're making a mistake. You can't push me out of the system. You don't even understand half the architecture." He leaned in, eyes sharp. "Then maybe you should have documented it better." That was the knife twist. That's when I saw it, not just ambition, but cruelty. The kind that doesn't blink when it burns down the very people who built it. I walked out of that office numb, knowing deep down the storm was about to hit. So when he called me in at 10 a.m. the next morning to restructure, I wasn't even surprised. Hurt, yes. Broken, not even close. Because by then, I'd already seen the red flags waving for months, bright, crimson, undeniable. I'd ignored them out of loyalty, out of hope. But betrayal doesn't happen overnight. It's built slowly, brick by brick, lie by lie, smile by smile. And as I sat in my car that morning, watching the tower gleam under the California sun, I realized something chilling. Marcus hadn't just fired me. He'd trained me to know his every weakness, every blind spot, every flaw. He'd shown me exactly how to destroy him, and that lesson was about to become very expensive. It was strange sitting in that cafe at 11:00 a.m. watching sunlight flicker through the glass, the world moving on like nothing had changed, while inside me, everything was breaking apart. Marcus had fired me, publicly, coldly, but even then, part of me clung to some small hope that maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe there was a reason. Maybe I'd wake up and this would all be some twisted dream. But that illusion didn't last long. Because at 11:37 a.m., the betrayal finally revealed itself, not through whispers, not through rumors, but in plain sight. My phone buzzed with a notification, a press release. Helix Dynamics announces full ownership of Neuralink X ahead of global launch. Marcus's smiling face dominated the thumbnail, hand raised triumphantly at some early investor briefing I hadn't even known existed. The article headline below cut deeper than any knife could. Hale's solo vision brings $560 million innovation to life. CEO calls it a dream realized. Solo vision, no mention of me, not once. My hands shook as I scrolled through the paragraphs. Words blurred, but certain ones burned into my mind like brands. Marcus Hale, founder and sole architect. After a recent internal restructuring, a streamlined leadership model focused entirely under Hale's direction. That restructuring was me. The man who built the foundation of Neuralink X had just been deleted from existence with a single word. I clicked the attached press kit images, quotes, signatures, my signature, except it wasn't mine. The licensing document I'd drafted months ago, the one outlining joint intellectual property, had been altered. My name, my e-signature, my share ownership clause gone. Replaced with an updated version timestamped 3 days ago. He'd used the company's internal access system to override my credentials and transfer 100% of the IP to Helix Dynamics' parent entity, which, of course, meant Marcus Hale. He hadn't just fired me. He'd stolen my life's work. I froze, staring at the screen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. $560 million. That was the project valuation at launch. And now it all belonged to him. Every sleepless night, every broken relationship, every sacrifice I made to make that technology real, he'd turned it into his personal trophy. For a few minutes, I couldn't even breathe. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was intimate. Personal. Marcus hadn't built Helix alone. He was Helix because of me. Without my code, my data structures, my encryption layers, Neuralink X wouldn't even exist. But to the world, he was now the visionary genius, the man who merged the human mind with artificial intelligence. And I was nothing more than a ghost, the kind people mention in passing before forgetting entirely. Anger came next. Slow at first, then consuming. It wasn't just rage at him. It was rage at myself for trusting him. How had I missed the signs, the secret meetings, the false smiles, the subtle changes in paperwork? All those minor updates I'd signed without reading every line because, well, who reads every clause when it's your partner? Apparently, that's exactly when you should. I slammed my laptop shut and sat there, gripping the edge of the table, trying to stop my hands from shaking. The cafe's chatter faded into static. I could taste copper in my mouth, a metallic reminder of how deep betrayal cuts. Because betrayal isn't just about losing something. It's about realizing the person you trusted most planned it. Around noon, I drove aimlessly through downtown San Francisco, city streets blurring into meaningless shapes. My mind kept replaying the same moments, Marcus shaking my hand on day one, promising partnership, loyalty, brotherhood. He'd lied so effortlessly. Somewhere between memory and madness, I pulled over near the Golden Gate Pier. The sea wind was sharp, cold, and real, something solid to hold onto when everything else felt fake. I stared at the water and whispered to myself, he stole it all. And then another voice, quieter, more dangerous, replied, not yet. By 12:15 p.m., I was back at my apartment. Laptop open, server logs running. I needed to see it to confirm every suspicion, to trace every digital knife he'd plunged into my back. I logged into the backup server, my private mirror of Helix's system. A safety copy I'd created months ago when things started feeling off. Marcus never knew it existed, and there it was, the transfer log. A 3-step override. Admin access, Marcus Hale, executive clearance, bypass IP assignment, confirmation, each action timestamped, with my old credentials listed as revoked. He hadn't even hidden it. He'd waited until I'd gone home that Friday evening. Then, sometime around 11:45 p.m., he'd accessed the internal registry and restructured ownership. The board had been informed the next morning, told I'd chosen to step away. He didn't just fire me at 10 a.m. He'd already erased me days before. For a long time, I just stared at that log file lines of code that spelled out my destruction. Then I noticed something odd. A small string buried in the metadata. NX core access signature equals A. Hale admin, that was the access tag tied to the Neuralink X system, the one I'd built myself. Every activation, every run, every server connection required a signature. Marcus's admin tag was fake. It looked valid on the surface, but it didn't match the deep layer encryption protocol, which meant one thing: the system might launch, but it wouldn't stay online. He thought he'd taken everything. But he'd taken a loaded gun without realizing it was pointed at himself. The irony almost made me laugh. Still, it wasn't enough. Part of me wanted to expose him right then, and there blast the proof online, ruin his image, destroy his reputation. But that would have been too easy, too clean. Marcus didn't deserve quick justice. He deserved to feel it: the fear, the loss, the realization that everything he'd built on lies was about to crumble. And to do that, I needed patience. I needed to wait until the perfect moment. Until the whole world was watching. 4:00 p.m. Launch time. That's when Neuralink X would go live on every major network stream, with reporters, investors, and government officials tuned in. That's when Marcus Hale would stand on stage, his smile that polished smile, and introduce the most advanced integrated AI system ever built. And that's when I'd make sure the truth revealed itself not through words, but through failure. The kind that can't be spun. By 1:30 p.m., my apartment looked like a digital war room. 2 laptops open, 3 encrypted drives running diagnostic scans, a VPN chain routing through 5 countries. Each keystroke felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. But between the code and the fury, there was still something else inside me: heartbreak. The kind that comes not from loss, but from betrayal by someone you once loved like family. Marcus had been more than a boss. He was a mentor, a friend, a brother I never had. We'd celebrated birthdays together, toasted over late night victories, joked about what we'd do when Helix went public. I'd even stood by him when the board questioned his spending, defended him when investors doubted his vision. And this was how he repaid me: by stealing my dream and kicking me out before payday. I sat back, running a hand over my face, exhaustion pressing down like weight. For a brief moment, I considered walking away, just disappearing, starting fresh. But then my eyes drifted to the framed printout on my wall: our first Helix prototype certificate. The one we'd signed together, both names side by side. I traced my finger over my own faded signature. No, he didn't get to erase me, not like this. I turned back to my laptop, opened a new terminal, and began typing commands: slow, deliberate, precise. Accessing. NX mainframe backup mode authentication key. AR. Verified override command prepared. I wasn't going to destroy Neuralink X. I was going to reclaim it. The system would still launch at 4 p.m., but not under Marcus's control. The world would see what I'd built and who truly owned it. And when the lights went down and his revolutionary system crashed live in front of millions, I'd be watching, calm, silent, patient, because vengeance, like good code, isn't rushed. It's written carefully. Line by line. The TV in the cafe was showing a loop of highlight reels: Marcus on stage, Marcus signing deals, Marcus smiling for the camera like a man who'd single-handedly reinvented humanity. The barista who'd once high-fived me over a successful late-night deploy didn't recognize my face when I walked in. She only glanced up, nodded at the screen, and mouthed, "Congrats, Marcus." The sound of his voice, warm and rehearsed, ricocheted through the little room and slammed into something raw inside me. For a second I felt hollow, like a shell washed up on a shore I didn't recognize. Then a different sensation rose: slow, hot, not just anger, but a clear, crystalline focus I hadn't felt since the first time the prototype blinked green on my monitor at 3 a.m., and we'd both stood there, speechless. It wasn't just about money anymore. It never had been. It was about the people who would benefit from Neuralink X, the stroke patients who could speak again, The veterans with prosthetics who might one day control a hand through thought alone. I thought of the quiet names in our test logs. Patient 017 increased motor response by 42%. Subject B regained partial speech. I'd coded those patterns into life because I believed in helping people, not because I wanted a photo op on a stage. That thought was a pivot. Not revenge for revenge's sake, but a reclaiming of purpose. Marcus had stolen my work. In doing so, he'd also attempted to steal a future for those people. If I let him launch Neuralink X under false pretenses, a product that would crumble because the activation signature was wrong, it would still put lives on the line. I realized I had a responsibility bigger than my ego. The realization hit me like a current. It was the moment I stopped being the wounded engineer and became the steward of what we'd built. Back at my apartment, the air smelled of burnt coffee and winter. The city hummed below like a distant motherboard. I pulled a forgotten photograph off a desk, Marcus and me, taken the night we incorporated, both of us ecstatic, faces smeared with pizza grease, hands clasped over a small, messy cake that read Helix, to the moon. In the photograph, his eyes weren't yet the polished mask they'd become. They were hopeful. There was a version of him I still mourned and a version I now hated. They were both true. One of them I would bury, the other I would use as fuel. I opened my terminal, but this time my fingers didn't tremble. They were steady. I set rules for myself. No impulsive broadcast, no immediate public shaming. The victory had to be undeniable, unassailable. If I merely tweeted proof, the lawyers would bury me, and investors would circle like vultures. I needed a move so clean it couldn't be spun, a transfer of reality that the world would have to accept. First, I cataloged everything, not just the obvious. The transfer logs, the altered docs, Marcus's forged signatures. I mapped dependencies, the modules that would fail without the true activation signature. The portions of the user interface tied to my encryption key. The silent partition I'd seeded months ago as an internal safety measure. That failsafe was my insurance policy, written in a mood I never wanted to use. Now, for the first time, I considered it a weapon of restoration. Second, I thought about witnesses. Names flashed through my head. Lee, who'd once stayed late to debug a memory leak with me. Josh, the low-level systems admin who still made bad jokes and brought donuts on Fridays. A handful of QA testers who'd cried when a simulation finally aligned with a neural response. Some of them were complicit in Marcus's new narrative. Others were coerced by fear. I needed allies, not martyrs. Third, I planned the optics. If I reclaimed ownership quietly, the technical community would still rally behind me. But if Marcus went live and the system failed spectacularly on national television, the narrative would already be framed. The visionary had launched a faulty product that would be satisfying but also messy. Instead, I aimed for a more elegant coup. Make the system demonstrate its true ownership in a way that made legal and technical reassignment impossible to dispute in the immediate term. I would not sabotage the technology. I wouldn't let innocence suffer for my anger. I would activate the truth. I called Lee. Her silence on the line grew long before she answered. Alex, she whispered. Her voice was tired, threaded with guilt. No games, go to the lab now. Tell Josh to bring the test rigs. Lock the door if you have to. Under no circumstances let Marcus walk in. My voice was a program minimal, efficient. I gave her the credentials to access a secure channel I'd set up for only her and me months ago. A place where we'd once left late. Night notes about a bug and a meme about temporary deadlines. There was a shakiness in her intake of breath that told me she'd been expecting this call in some form. What are you doing, Alex? Fixing what he broke, I said, and saving us from a disaster. She hesitated then, a quiet, decisive yes. She hung up. While she moved, I executed the first technical steps. In the background, I initiated a partial sync from my private backup mirror to a distributed chain of nodes. I controlled a technical escrow. It was grubby work, the kind that only the obsessive do well: versions, hashes, timestamps. Everything had to be perfect, or the system would reject the sync as a tampered copy. I wrote scripts that would, at 3:50 p.m., start broadcasting a signed token tied to the real owner mine through an array of relay servers. The token wouldn't interfere with the launch. On the contrary, it would appear as a benign subsystem check. But layered beneath that check was an authoritative proof of ownership. Cryptographic signatures only I could generate. When those signatures echoed through the mainframe, the ownership would be provable to anyone who knew where to look: engineers, auditors, and, crucially, the independent oversight teams Helix had promised investors they'd employ. I thought of the people who would listen: cybersecurity teams, academic partners, a few journalists who'd made a career out of finding cracks in corporate narratives. This had to be precise enough for them to verify in real time. As my scripts compiled, I felt the old joy creep back in the joy of building, of solving puzzles. Rage was a fuel, focus was the engine. I was no longer consumed by the question who had betrayed me. I was consumed by a more powerful one. What will I let this work become? The answer was a revival of everything I'd hoped Helix would be. There was another trigger I hadn't expected. A voicemail from my mother, left at 1:18 p.m. Her voice, small and proud, said, "I saw Marcus on TV. I wish you two had called us before this big night. I'm so proud, Alex." The sweetness of the message made my throat ache. I listened to it twice, then placed my phone face down and exhaled. Not for my pride, for the truth, for the patience, for the people who would rely on this tech, for the part of me that had stayed up nights, bugging memory leaks because a test subject's smile was worth more than headline money. By 2:00 p.m., the lab was a quiet war room. Lee and Josh moved like ghosts, precise, efficient. Lee's eyes met mine once, and in them I saw fear melted into resolve. We worked without words, like a band that didn't need a conductor. 3:00 p.m. arrived with a clinical calm. The scripts were in place, the relay servers were warmed, the escrow nodes were synchronized and authenticated. I prepared the final command: not to take, but to reveal. Not to humiliate, but to restore. When you build something meant to connect minds, you learn to be gentle with it. Tonight, I would be merciless with the man who tried to steal it. But the mercy would be for everyone else, for the project, for the people it could help, and even for Marcus, who would finally have to face the consequences of becoming a brand instead of a human. I leaned back in my chair and felt something settle in my chest, a certainty that felt almost like peace. Hurt had forged a blade, purpose had sharpened it. The shift was complete. Outside, the city lightened toward evening. In a few short hours, a stage would light up, and a man would claim a birthright that wasn't his. I closed my laptop for a moment and whispered, not to anyone, "Let's see how pretty your suit looks when the lights go out." Then I opened it again, the cursor blinking like a countdown. You don't win a war by yelling from the rooftops. You win it by setting the stage so carefully that when the curtain rises, the audience already knows what to believe before the villain even gets to speak. After the pivot in the lab, after the moment, I became less a man bent on revenge and more a steward of what we built. Everything I did was deliberate. There were no theatrics, no public tirades, only a cold, methodical architecture of proof and pressure. The plan had 3 interlocking parts: collect irrefutable evidence, create a verifiable claim no lawyer could bury overnight, and stage a reveal that would make the lie impossible to sell. Step 1. Fortify the evidence. Evidence is useless without provenance. I had stolen moments of it from Marcus already: the altered documents, the transfer logs, the forged timestamps, but I needed more than files on my drive. I needed witnesses, independent verification, and a timeline that a court, a regulator, or an attentive journalist could trace without relying on me. So I cataloged everything I had and rebuilt the paper trail around it. Not by forging new documents, but by reassembling the originals and layering them with immutable markers. Copies stored in multiple secure locations, contemporaneous notes from people who'd been present at meetings, recorded chat threads, and archived backups that predated the alleged transfer. I reached out quietly to 3 people I trusted: Lee, Josh, and an external auditor we'd used briefly during the prototype phase, and asked them to preserve any files they had, to take screenshots of internal dashboards, and to keep copies in a secure locker I controlled. I didn't ask them to hack anything. I asked them to testify to what they already knew. That distinction mattered. I was building a case, not committing a crime. Step 2. Build the public, verifiable anchor. Technical proof was my backbone, but narrative is the skull that holds it all together. I needed an anchor, a piece of evidence so authoritative that it could be independently checked by an outside expert within minutes. For us, that anchor would be cryptographic signatures and time-stamped backups that tied the ownership to a verifiable identity at specific moments in time. I prepared those artifacts painstakingly. Pre-launch backups, notarized statements from the external auditor, metadata records from our internal test rigs, and a sealed ledger of the original IP assignment drafts. All of these were pushed to neutral, trusted third-party repositories, places investors and regulators habitually check. I also fed a small slice of this package to a cybersecurity journalist I'd once helped when her site was down. I did not leak an exposed archive with a dramatic headline. I gave her a locked verification file and a hint where to find a public key. If she chose to verify it, she'd have everything she needed to confirm the chronology without my commentary. If she didn't, the dossier would still exist in cold storage, time-stamped and immutable. Step 3. Set the traps ethical and legal. If the launch proceeded on Marcus's terms, the system would appear to work at first. Superficial demos and polished talking points would fool most of the audience. The trap wasn't a sabotage. It was a contingency that made the truth bloom on its own terms. I created a controlled demonstration environment that, if queried by independent verifiers, would produce the original signatures and operational logs proving my authorship. That environment was accessible through the escrow nodes I had synchronized. Neutral servers that mirrored the authentic production environment but could be open to auditors and press on demand. This way, if any reputable engineer, regulator, or journalist attempted to inspect Neuralink X's provenance immediately after the launch, they would find the genuine, verifiable traces of my work, not a set of cleverly faked admin tags. The truth would be machine, verifiable, not dependent on a single person's word. Step 4. Recruit quiet allies. You can't dismantle a brand alone. Even the smallest organizations have people who are willing to risk a little truth for a lot of justice. Lee was the obvious ally, brilliant, scared, loyal. Josh was a softer recruit. He loved the team and hated being lied to. The external auditor, practical and professional, she wanted facts, not drama. I approached each of them not as conspirators but as stewards of integrity. We rehearsed responses. We planned what documents to release first and which to hold back for later stages if Marcus tried to respond with legal muscle. We prepared lines for a short, factual briefing, no emotional op-eds, no finger-pointing that would go to the press and to regulatory offices if Marcus attempted to spin the launch into an uncontested victory. Step 5. The timing mechanism. Everything hinged on timing. The launch would be a media circus. The investors would be wired in. The regulators might be offline, trusting the company's internal declarations. To circumvent that, I wrote a sequence of non-technical triggers, simple, human actions that would set our plan in motion. At 3:40 p.m., Lee would initiate the verification channel we'd prepared. At 3:50 p.m., I would push the public token, not a hack, but a broadcast containing a public key and a pointer to the escrowed proofs. At 3:55 p.m., the journalist would receive a heads-up to check the repository. At 4:00 p.m., when Marcus smiled and started his speech, the world's eyes would already have the tools to verify who actually owned the underlying IP. Every step had redundancies. If one channel failed, another would pick up the slack. If the journalist didn't respond, the external auditor was prepared to contact a regulator. If Marcus' PR team tried to bury the narrative, the chain of custody would remain intact and legally defensible. Step 6. Psychological pressure letting the villain feel in control. A crucial part of the plan was that Marcus had to feel untouchable until the moment the curtain fell. If he sensed what we were doing, he'd call lawyers, buy up cloud snapshots, and attempt to sequester evidence. So we let him bask in his victory. We amplified his illusion of control by doing nothing publicly. Lee smiled at him when he passed. Josh kept making jokes in the game space. I posted nothing. In the week leading up to the launch, we were the picture of complicity. Inside, we were coiled, calm, patient. Step 7. The safety lines for people, not ego. I refused to weaponize the tech itself. There were options that would have torpedoed the launch in a way that would have risked real-world harm. I didn't take them. This was not about destruction. It was about restoration and truth. Our triggers were legal, verifiable, and aimed to let the system speak for itself. If Neuralink X was going to be used on patients after the launch, I wanted that future to be real and safe, not a PR stunt that could hurt people when the system inevitably showed design compromises. As the afternoon drew closer, the building hummed with a nervous electricity. Marcus strode through the hallways like a man already immortalized. He posted rehearsal photos, retweeted investor praise, and practiced his lines in front of the mirror. He had no idea our quiet machine of proof was spinning up in the background. That was the worst part. Him so sure of his victory. It made every waiting minute feel heavier, like a coiled spring compressed until it could no longer be held. At 3:30 p.m. I checked the list one last time. The evidence was in place, the third. Party verifications were primed. Lee and Josh were prepped and waiting in the lab, eyes bright with a mix of fear and iron resolve. The journalist had confirmed she'd checked the repository. The external auditor had her calendar open and aligned to a regulatory contact on standby. I breathed in. I breathed out. I turned my phone to silent and watched Marcus walk to the stage. On paper, he still owned the narrative. On the network of escrowed proofs, the truth was already indexed, sealed, and ready to be revealed. When the clock approached 4:00 p.m., everything felt sudden and inevitable at once. The tension was no longer about whether I could pull it off. It was whether the world would look, whether the people who mattered would verify, and whether Marcus' polished stage smile could survive the first genuine question. We had set the traps. The stage was lit. The audience had assembled. Now all that remained was to let the system speak. The auditorium lights dimmed to a practiced hush. 4,000 people leaned forward as Marcus Hale stepped into the spotlight, polished, confident, the kind of presence that turned every camera lens into an accomplice. He wore the same blue suit he always wore for photo ops, the suit that had become a visual shorthand: trust, success, genius. A single rail of spotlights carved his silhouette against the giant screen behind him, which flashed the company logo and the tagline everyone had rehearsed for months: Neuralink X, the future now. Backstage, the lab hummed like a living thing. Lee's fingers danced across a tablet. Josh watched the live feed of the auditorium we'd been monitoring for weeks. My own station was quieter. A small, sterile terminal in a closet-sized room with a one-way glass that let me watch Marcus take the stage. My heartbeat was a metronome, steady, patient. The scripts were scheduled. The relay servers were warmed. The escrow repository had been unlocked with a time-locked token that would reveal itself on the network at 3:50 p.m. Marcus began with the usual cadence: the origin story, the polished struggle, the dramatized leap from garage to global stage. He smiled, and the crowd smiled back. Investors were live on a dozen feeds. Venture partners beamed on side screens. Cameras panned to faces in the front row. Senators, tech advisors, philanthropic partners, the very journalists who had once asked tough questions, but had been placated by glossy PR kits. At 3:55 p.m. Marcus reached for his clincher, the reveal of the technology demo. He motioned toward the live feed of a patient in a lab setup across town, a carefully rehearsed participant who'd been briefed to nod and smile on cue. Marcus's voice, softened with the exact amount of gravitas PR had trained him to use. Today, he said, we launch not just a product, but a new era. Applause rolled like thunder. Then, at 3:56 p.m., A small, almost imperceptible ripple began to move through the auditorium feeds. A tiny side window popped on a producer's console, showing a repository ping. An authorized cryptographic token with a public key handshake coming from a set of neutral escrow nodes. The token contained one line of plain metadata: owner signature, Alex Ransom, original architect. The token's digital certificate pointed auditors toward the sealed ledger we'd prepared. A camera operator in the press pit noticed it first, a frown creasing his forehead as he toggled between feeds. "Is that?" he muttered. The journalist I'd tipped received the locked verification file along with the pointer, and, with the instincts of someone who'd smelled a story before, opened it. Her voice was low, professional. "I'm going to verify this publicly," she said into her earpiece. Marcus, in the middle of his line about vision, didn't notice the tiny shock beginning to ripple across the control room monitors. He kept smiling for the cameras. He had no idea that the first domino had been nudged. At 3:58 p.m. the first verifier pinged back, the signatures matched. The external auditor, who'd been sitting in a hospitality suite with a half-empty water bottle and an impartial expression, clicked the verification link and watched the chain of custody unfold on her tablet. Her fingers tightened around the device. She called down to her contact at her regulatory office and murmured, "You should look at this, now." Backstage, Lee's mouth formed one word and one word only: now. She hit the button that initiated our public broadcast. A short, unremarkable packet that included the public key and a redirection link to the escrowed proofs. The packet was designed to look like a routine system check, something technical directors often ignored during live events, but it also contained exactly what an independent engineer or auditor would need to verify ownership within seconds. The auditorium's giant screen flickered. For a second, the production team assumed it was a glitch. Then the screen split. On one side, Marcus continued his speech. On the other, a series of technical stamps began to unspool timestamps, hash values, archival references. Someone in the front row stood up, puzzled. Cameras zoomed on the screen. The journalist opened the escrow link live, and the chat feed in the auditorium exploded with 1,000 "What's that?" S and "Check this" S. Marcus's smile faltered for the tiniest fragment of a second. He kept talking, voice steady but faster now, trying to crowd out the static of 1,000 smartphones beginning to point at the screen. "This is a routine verification," he said, voice smooth like oil. "We do these all the time." It wasn't routine. The auditor had, with a few skilled swipes, verified the ledger. The signatures were irrefutable. The ownership trail led right back to me, to the original drafts, to notarized pre-launch backups, to the very metadata Marcus had attempted to overwrite. For the first time on that stage, Marcus faced an external authority that didn't take his word. The PR team tried to pivot. Microphones were jammed with background music. A feed was cut, but the network is a hydra. Cutting one feed only reroutes another. The cybersecurity journalist whispered into her mic, "We've got the chain of custody. Independent verification shows original IP belongs to Alex Ransom. Marcus Hale's claimed admin tokens are inconsistent with deep layer signatures." She sent the verification link into the live chat. The link went viral in seconds. Panic moved through the auditorium like a live current. Investors' faces hardened. One of the venture partners stood up, voice booming, "Explain this." Marcus's eyes flicked to the production crew, to his PR lead, to the legal counsel, who had been smiling from the wings all day. He found none of them able to offer immediate reassurance. The legal counsel's phone lit with texts he hadn't seen coming. Marcus's composure, polished and rehearsed for years, fractured like glass under a hammer. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus said a little too loudly, "there's been a technical discrepancy. We will resolve this." His speech faltered. People in the crowd shouted questions. Flashbulbs popped like a staccato drumline. On social media, clips of the split screen verification were already trending under the hashtag some nimble viewer had coined, #who owns Neuralink. At that moment, An automated legal freeze we'd prearranged with the external auditor, and a regulatory contact kicked in. The auditor made a brief, factual announcement over the venue's internal channels. An investigation into the IP assignment had been initiated, and all launch-related declarations were paused pending verification. That pause was procedural and immediate. It meant live demonstrations had to stop. The giant screen faded to black. Marcus, mid-sentence, looked at the darkened screen as if it had betrayed him. He tried to maintain control by calling for calm, by insisting the issue was a minor administrative oversight. But the investors were no longer listening to reassurance. They were listening to the documents they could now check themselves. The lead investor's jaw clenched. Phones were out, lawyers were dialing, the auditorium's mood shifted from celebratory to forensic. I watched the scene through the one-way glass. Lee's hand found mine. We squeezed, a brief human anchor. Josh let out a long breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. In the press pit, the journalist's headline flashed, "Launch halted, ownership dispute erupts live as crypto. Signature names original architect." Within 5 minutes, it was the lead story on every tech feed. Marcus tried to salvage it, an impassioned plea, a truncated demo, promises of transparent audits. But words are only as powerful as the evidence that backs them. The proof was already public, machine, verifiable, and time-stamped. The company's stock feeds, private but monitored by investors, showed immediate withdrawals. A few large backers paused their commitments pending a full audit. The PR narrative dissolved into a legal one. On the stage, as cameras kept rolling, Marcus's features hardening with disbelief, I felt a cold clarity more intoxicating than the triumph I'd imagined. Justice, administered not as spectacle, but as exactness. He had expected a victory lap. Instead, he faced a precise, unarguable correction. Security escorted him off the stage, eventually not as a criminal that would come later, after regulators and law firms did their work, but as a leader whose claims were in dispute. Photographers followed. Livestreams caught the moment his usual smile slipped away and something raw replaced it. The recognition that a story he'd written about himself had been unspooled in public. Outside, investors convened, texts flew, and the earliest legal inquiries were filed. Within an hour, a temporary legal injunction, facilitated by the escrow teams and backed by clear chain of custody evidence, froze the company's launch assets. The world that had been ready to hand Marcus $560 million paused instead to let auditors, courts, and the media decide. Back in the lab, Lee laughed, a short, breathless thing that sounded like release. Josh punched the air and then immediately looked guilty for celebrating. I let my legs slump. The adrenaline in my veins felt like cold water. It had worked. The launch had not been sabotaged, it had been corrected. On live television, analysts replayed the split-screen verification. He didn't just get fired at 10 a.m. One anchor said into the camera, voice wrapped in incredulity. By 4 p.m., the launch had been hijacked back into the hands of its rightful owner. The phrasing landed everywhere because it told the whole truth in a sentence. The reversal had been technical, legal, and public. Marcus would, of course, fight back. He had resources, lawyers, and a brand to defend. That was inevitable, but for a moment, for the first time since the press release that had erased me, the world had seen the ledger. Proof had a way of being stubborn. It lived longer than polished campaigns or rehearsed smiles. As the auditorium emptied in a stunned, buzzing haze, I walked out into the cool evening air with Lee and Josh at my side. Cameras followed, but for once they were not hunting a scandal. They were documenting an unraveling, and the image that would circulate for months was simple and unadorned. A tech CEO escorted off stage, while the cryptographic trail he hoped to bury glowed like a neon confession on a giant screen. We had not destroyed Helix Dynamics. We had, in the cleanest possible way, reclaimed the narrative. The $560 million launch might still happen, but it would now happen with the truth unavoidably attached to it. And Marcus, he had learned something ineffable and terrible. A brand built on someone else's work can look invincible until an immutable signature proves otherwise. The curtain fell. The cameras kept rolling. The world, at that precise cinematic moment, finally saw who'd really written the code. The world doesn't collapse all at once. It unravels thread by thread, truth by truth, headline by headline. And for Marcus Hale, that unraveling began the moment the spotlight dimmed. By the next morning, the news was everywhere. $560M tech launch halted after ownership scandal. Whistleblower engineer exposes fraud in real time. From visionary to villain, Marcus Hale's empire under audit. Every major outlet ran the same splits. Green image Marcus standing frozen mid-speech while the verification code flashed behind him like a digital confession. It became one of those viral moments you couldn't scroll past. The kind that made people stop, rewind, and whisper, "Did you see that? He got caught live." The mighty founder of Helix Dynamics, Silicon Valley's golden boy, had turned into a cautionary tale overnight. By 9:00 a.m., the company's board called an emergency meeting. Investors demanded explanations, auditors demanded access, and the regulators demanded documentation. For the first time in years, Marcus wasn't behind the boardroom glass, he was on it, projected as the accused. The system we'd built had left digital fingerprints in every corner of Helix's infrastructure, and every fingerprint pointed to the same truth. I was the original architect. My code, my encryption, my neural mapping, all authenticated beyond argument. The internal audit revealed the falsified admin logs, the altered contracts, and the midnight transfers Marcus had made using my revoked credentials. There was no more room for denial. Every lie he had built his brand on collapsed under the weight of verifiable data. Helix Dynamics didn't implode, it shed its skin. Within 48 hours, Marcus was temporarily suspended pending investigation. Within a week, his personal assets were frozen, and within a month, his name was removed from the company he'd stolen from me. As for me, I didn't step back into the CEO chair not because I couldn't, but because I wouldn't. I'd already spent years building something beautiful only to watch it rot from the inside. I didn't want to rebuild another empire. I wanted to build something pure. Helix's board approached me with an offer, a reinstatement, stock compensation, even a public apology. I accepted the ownership rights, but not the power seat. Instead, I created something smaller, a foundation named Project Origin. Its mission, to protect creators from corporate theft, to give engineers, artists, and inventors the one thing they lose the moment they sign the wrong dotted line: ownership. We built a new kind of ledger, one that verified creative authorship in real time, locking every original work behind cryptographic proof that couldn't be stolen, altered, or reassigned. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very code Marcus tried to steal had now become the weapon against every future Marcus waiting to rise, and that was enough. But justice didn't stop there. When the regulatory hearings began, Marcus came clean, or at least tried to. He blamed clerical errors, miscommunication, even system bugs, but the evidence was too precise, too well constructed to spin. Every forged document had its digital DNA. Every missing signature had a shadow copy. Every deleted email existed in my encrypted backups. When the commission played aside, by side of his statements versus the verified logs, his voice cracked. That moment captured live spread almost as widely as the original launch scandal. The press didn't call it a downfall. They called it poetic justice, because the same technology Marcus had used to erase my name had exposed him. His crime was recorded by the very system he tried to steal. A few months later, I ran into him by chance, not in a boardroom or at a conference, but in a quiet courthouse hallway. His suit didn't fit quite as perfectly anymore. His eyes looked older. He carried himself like a man who still hadn't accepted that the applause was gone. He stopped when he saw me. "Alex," he said softly, almost human again, "you won." I looked at him for a long moment. "No," I said, "I just made things right." He nodded, but there was no pride left in him. Only regret. I shouldn't have. I cut him off gently. You shouldn't have needed to. He lowered his gaze and walked away. That was the last time I saw him. Helix Dynamics recovered eventually. The new leadership team ran a transparent relaunch months later, this time with the right name on the patents. I attended not as an employee, not as an enemy, but as a guest. When the host thanked the original engineer whose vision made this all possible, the audience stood and applauded. Not for me, but for the truth. It wasn't vengeance I felt that day. It was closure. Time passed. The scandal became a legend, the story of how a CEO tried to steal a $560 million launch and was exposed by the man he underestimated. Universities used the case as an ethics study. Tech startups implemented new transparency systems based on Project Origin. And somewhere in the digital archives of Silicon Valley, a short line of code still carried my signature, not as revenge, but as a reminder: integrity doesn't need a spotlight. It only needs proof. There were nights when I'd replay the whole thing, the firing at 10 a.m., the headlines by 4 p.m., the split-screen truth. And every time, the same thought crossed my mind: Marcus didn't destroy me when he fired me. He freed me to become someone untouchable, because power built on deceit collapses. But power built on truth that never dies. And maybe that's what poetic justice really means. It's not watching the villain burn. It's watching the truth outlive him. Screen fades to black. A heartbeat sound plays, then the faint clicking of a keyboard. Alex's voice narration: you know, betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it wears your friend's smile. Sometimes it signs your paycheck. Sometimes it calls you partner. Pause, but here's what they never expect: the quiet ones, the loyal ones, the ones who build things instead of stealing them. We remember everything. We document everything. And when the time comes, we don't need to destroy them. We let the truth do it for us. Camera cuts to Alex looking straight into the lens, calm, certain, free. Alex, if you've ever been betrayed by a boss, a friend, a family member, tell me your story in the comments, because you're not alone. And if you've ever lost something to someone who thought they could erase you, remember my story. Slight smile. Marcus fired me at 10 a.m. By 4 p.m. the $560 million launch, his pride, his empire, his illusion belonged to me. Pause. The music swells, softly strings and low drums. In the end, he taught me the most valuable lesson of all: when you build something with integrity, even your enemies can't delete your name. If you've ever faced betrayal and rose stronger, this story is for you. Tell me your story in comments below. What would you have done in Alex's place? Subscribe for more powerful stories of truth, justice, and redemption. Because sometimes, revenge isn't destruction, it's restoration. My boss fired me at 10 a.m. By 4 p.m. His $560 million launch belonged